6 months ago, I started this podcast because of the promise I made to myself after burnout. Today, I want to tell you what that promise was and why it changes everything.
Hey you, welcome to Selfish Me. I'm Cam, a business psychologist and a proud late bloomer who finally stopped living by everyone else's rules. And this is your space to pause, reconnect, and build a life that feels true to you. Because putting yourself first isn't selfish, it's powerful.
Hello, you. Selfish Me has now been live for 6 months, and I just want to say thank you. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for supporting this little corner of the internet. It honestly means the world to me. I started this podcast to create a space where you can reconnect with yourself, build a life that feels true to who you are, and learn yourself first. Because putting yourself first isn't selfish, it's powerful. As we reach this milestone, today's episode is going to be a little bit different. In fact, I'm recording on Wednesday evening, just a few hours before it goes live. I sat down to write this week's episode, and the words just wouldn't come. Not because I didn't know what I want to say, but because I realized something bigger was happening. Over the past few weeks, I've been reflecting on what I truly want this podcast to become. 8 years ago, after burnout, I made a promise to myself. It's still the quote on my phone's lock screen today. And it says, one day you will tell your story of how you overcame what you are going through now. And it will become part of someone else's survival guide. And this podcast is the result of that promise. Looking back over the last 8 years, I have been asking myself one question. What actually helped me rebuild my life? Not just recover from burnout, but build a life that finally feels like mine. Now, I just want to caveat. That doesn't mean life has been perfect. The last few months have been an emotional roller coaster, but that's a conversation for another day. What it does mean is that for the first time, my life feels like it's truly mine, with all the good and challenging stuff. As I have reflected on those 8 years, I have been trying to understand what actually got me here. What were the things that created the biggest shift? More importantly, what can I share with you that might help you do the same? I've loved the conversations we had about health, relationship, careers, sexuality, and challenging the assumptions we inherit about all of them. And I hope the tools and ideas I have shared helped you. But I realized something. Something was missing. Those tools weren't what changed my life. They supported the change. When I hit burnout, I genuinely did not know where to begin. I did not know how I felt, what I wanted, or even who I was anymore. I felt disconnected from my own life. It was as though life was happening to me rather than for me. I felt like a passive observer, watching a story that had already been written, knowing exactly what the next chapter was supposed to be, because I was living a life built on other people's expectations, the expectations of my family, society. I worked so hard to create the life that eventually my body couldn't keep going. I burned out. I developed anxiety and secondary depression. I genuinely believed I was failing at life, failing at being an adult. While my friends and colleagues were getting engaged, moving in together with their partners, buying homes, and taking all of the milestones we've been taught to strive for, I was sitting in my therapist's office in tears, convinced that something was wrong with me. I remember saying to my therapist over and over again, I'm broken, you need to fix me. Why am I telling you this? Because that's the moment I made the promise I mentioned at the beginning of this episode. As painful as burnout was, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone, it forced me to stop. It forced me to look at my life through completely different lenses. And what I've noticed is the noise around me that stopped me from making a distinction between what I wanted and what is expected of me. Like I thought I wanted to be married. I thought I wanted children before I turned 30. And when those things didn't happen, I experienced two emotions at exactly the same time. Grief and relief. Grief for the life I thought I was supposed to have. And relief that I didn't have to live it. And here's the part I've been trying to put into words. And to be honest, my brain is still working through it, so please bear with me. This is very much a work in progress. I'm also recording this from Poland, and I've hit that point where my English and Polish are blending together. Sometimes I don't feel like I'm expressing myself properly in either language. If you're bilingual, you might know exactly what I mean. But let's go back to it. What I have come to realize is that so many of the things I was working towards weren't necessarily what I wanted. They were results of conditioning. And that's something every single one of us experiences from a young age. During therapy, my therapist introduced me to something we called in our conversations underlying scripts. These scripts are made up of beliefs, expectations, and the messages we've absorbed throughout lives, both consciously and unconsciously. Some came from our families, some came from school, culture, religion, workplace, media, you name it. And over time, those messages stopped feeling like opinions and start feeling like facts. The thing is, I had no idea which of those scripts were serving me and which were stopping me from creating a life that actually felt like mine. I couldn't tell the difference between what I genuinely wanted and what I have been conditioned to want. That show up in everything, from the small everyday choices I made to the biggest questions in my life, like whether I even wanted children. There was so much noise around me that I found myself constantly overthinking. So I started listening a little less to the noise and a little more to my body, because every time I allowed myself to really feel, instead of immediately analyzing everything, my body gave me clues. It would tell me when something felt aligned. It would tell me when something didn't. The funny thing is, my body had been trying to communicate with me for years. It gave me signs that I was pushing too hard, that I wasn't resting, that something wasn't right. But I ignored those signals until eventually my body made a decision for me through panic attacks and burnout. Looking back now, I realized my body wasn't working against me. It was trying to protect me. That's when I started running what I call now mini experiments. Whenever I couldn't tell the difference between what I truly wanted and what I had been conditioned to want, I stopped trying to think my way through the answer. Instead, I became curious. I experimented. I gave myself permission to explore. And you have actually heard many of those experiments throughout this podcast. I froze my eggs not because I decided I wanted children, but because I wanted to create enough space to discover how I truly feel about motherhood without the constant pressure of biological clock. I explore my sexuality to understand what genuinely brings me pleasure, instead of believing there was something wrong with me because I didn't orgasm through penetration. And alongside those personal experiments, I immersed myself in research. I read books, I explored different areas of psychology, I look at history. I want to understand the bigger picture because so many of the beliefs we carry don't begin with us. For example, women in many countries couldn't open a bank account or make certain financial decisions without a man's permission until surprisingly recently, which is around 1970s. Also, women were only routinely included in medical research from the early 90s onwards, which helps explain why so many women's health concerns are still misunderstood or dismissed today. Understanding the bigger picture changed something for me. It helped me realize that many of the struggles I thought were personal failures were actually shaped by system, culture, and history. And instead of asking myself, what's wrong with me? Why am I broken? I started asking, where did this script come from? Because once you understand where a script comes from, you get to decide whether it still deserves a place in your life. So what does this mean for selfish me? It means this podcast is evolving. For a moment, I thought about pressing pause until I had everything figured out. But then I realized that I would be falling back into one of my old scripts, the belief that I have to have all the answers before I can share them. So instead, I want to invite you into the process, because none of us has a life completely figured out. We are all learning, questioning, growing as we go. And I think there is something really powerful about allowing yourself to be seen in the messy middle. What do I know is this. I want this podcast to help women recognize the invisible scripts that have been shaping their lives and give them the tools to decide whether those scripts still fit the life they want to create. How? I don't know exactly yet, but I know where I'm heading, even if I don't have every step mapped out. And maybe that's enough. So today marks the beginning of a new chapter for Selfish Me. And speaking of new chapters, I am about to start my biggest experiment yet. At the end of this month, I am moving to Africa. This has been happening quietly in the background for over a year. And now it's finally become real. It's exciting, a little scary, and definitely pushing me outside of my comfort zone. I'll be sharing more about that journey in the future episodes. And I will also be taking you behind the scenes over on Instagram as I navigate this chapter. Because if there is one thing I have learned, is that the biggest growth often begins with the courage to run an experiment. All right, until next week. Bye.
Thank you so much for listening. It honestly means the world to me. If something from today's chat made you smile, think, or feel seen, share it. That's how our Selfish Me community grows. This podcast is about real voices and reminding each other that we are not alone. We are all figuring out how to do life our way, and you are doing better than you think.